Chapter 15, Depression and Dictatorship. Part 1, The Great Depression. Section 1, Early Attempts to Answer the Economic Crisis. Hoover's Indecision. The October 1929 crash occurred during the first year of the presidency of the Republican Herbert Hoover, the famous philanthropist who, at the end of the Great War, had organized a huge relief effort for the starving people of war-torn Belgium. Now it was his turn to do something about a worsening economic picture in America. Capitalism on trial. In the face of this massive shock to the American stock market, Hoover tended to follow the common wisdom of the Republican Party, which had long dominated American politics, which was simply to follow the central principle of capitalism and let the market correct itself. It was not the government's job to meddle with the nation's economy. Hoover looked especially to his Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, for encouragement and advice. But Mellon's approach to the Depression was not only Republican, but even rather Darwinian. Government should not intervene, but instead allow a natural liquidation or shakeout of weak or poor business factors, notably labor, farmers, and small businesses, in the market mechanism. But ultimately, this philosophy helped no one, not even the big capitalists, who depended on an affluent society to sell their products to. Enforced poverty helped no one. The economy worsened. Eventually, Mellon was dismissed by Hoover, though only when his failure to pay federal income taxes was discovered. Foolish trade barriers. Congress at one point attempted to help the economy through the erecting of new trade barriers, the infamous Hawley-Smoot tariff, designed to protect struggling American producers. But it only made the situation far worse. It stirred up a trade war with America's trade partners who, in retaliation against American protectionism, moved to protect their own industries from American competition. Ultimately, this merely shrank the Western economies all the more. Belated government efforts to support the economy. Finally, and belatedly, as the economy continued to fail to revive, 1/4 of the American workers were unemployed, Hoover began to propose government measures to try to help out the worst parts of the economy. The 1932 Emergency Relief and Construction Act attempted to start up public works programs to put the unemployed to work and to provide government-secured capital to help start up industries. But these measures came too late to swing the country back in support of his presidency. Besides, the Democrats smelled political victory in the November 1932 elections and were not in the mood to be very cooperative with the Hoover presidency, which they were pleased to blame as the cause of the Depression. The Bonus Army, 1932. One sad incident that happened towards the end of Hoover's presidency was the March on Washington of the Bonus Army in the summer of 1932. The marchers came to Washington, D.C. to demand their veterans' bonus payments early from Congress, bonus that had been promised them for their service in the Great War. But the payments were not due to begin until 1945. The veterans wanted them now, even if that meant they would be receiving these bonuses at a lower rate. They and their families needed the money now in order to survive. After several months of camping near the Anacostia River, and after several confrontations with police, federal troops, commanded by Douglas MacArthur and his staff assistant Dwight Eisenhower, aided by George Patton, upon orders by Hoover, drove the marchers from the city. The roughness of the police and the troops on these veterans of the war shocked the nation, and further alienated the people from the Hoover administration. Section 2, Roosevelt's New Deal. The election of 1932. Hoover was an easy target for his opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the 1932 presidential race. Roosevelt took Hoover to task for his many failures as president in dealing with this national crisis. Ironically, one of his favorite lines of attack during the campaign was Hoover's extravagant spending in order to buy the country out of the economic crisis, and how Hoover wanted to turn Washington into the control center of the American economy. Roosevelt's vice presidential running mate, Nance Garner, even accused Hoover of advancing the cause of socialism in America. How ironic, for the incoming Roosevelt presidency would not only undertake directly exactly these kinds of measures, but would do so in massive proportion. The November elections were sad for Hoover and elating for Roosevelt. Roosevelt had received 57.4% of the popular vote to only 39.7% for Hoover. And the electoral vote went 472 for Roosevelt and 52 for Hoover. The making of the president. Roosevelt had been born in 1882 in the Hudson River Valley town of Hyde Park to a very prominent New York family, and was raised as an only child in considerable privilege, watched over carefully by a doting mother, Sarah. Sarah, who was of Massachusetts stock, directed him to spend his summers in her home state, when not in Europe, which the family also visited every year, and had him enrolled in the prestigious Groton Academy in northern Massachusetts. Most significantly, here under the direction of the Episcopal priest and school headmaster Endicott Peabody, he was taught the importance of those raised to privilege in developing a commitment to public service, but also the importance of a strong Christian sense of responsibility towards those less fortunate than they. This effort of Peabody's would not be lost on Roosevelt. As was generally expected of a Groton boy, he then went on to study at Harvard, where he continued his standing as an average student. But while at Harvard, he began to develop political ambitions, particularly with his uncle Theodore, that is, Teddy Roosevelt, becoming U.S. president at the time. He now had a political role model to follow, however, as a Democrat, unlike his Republican uncle, and nearly all those around him, even since he'd entered Groton, who were also Republicans. With the death of his father James at the end of 1900, Roosevelt's mother Sarah became even more directly engaged in her son's life. She'd even followed him to Boston when he was at Harvard. But Franklin finally found that a relationship which developed in 1902 with Eleanor Roosevelt, that's Teddy's niece and a distant cousin of Franklin's, allowed him to free himself considerably from his mother's domineering ways. Sarah was very opposed to Franklin's and Eleanor's relationship. The next year he graduated from Harvard and entered Columbia Law School in New York City, and a year and a half later, March 1905, married Eleanor. Then, soon having passed the New York State bar exam, he could see no reason for continuing his law studies and dropped out of Columbia in 1907. The next year, he took a job with a New York City Wall Street firm where he specialized in corporate law. His marriage with Eleanor was not an easy one for either of the two. They had 6 children in fairly short order between 1906 and 1916, although the third child died soon after birth. They both took the child's death very hard. Also, in moving after their marriage to the Roosevelt estate, that is Springwood, Sarah moved in with them, a constant source of irritation for Eleanor. Also, Franklin had a fascination with a number of other women, producing scandals, especially his affair with Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Divorce was considered, but Lucy was not interested in a marriage with Franklin. There are too many complications. His marriage with Eleanor thus somehow survived after he promised not ever to see Lucy again, a promise he did not keep. But it was a cold marriage, mostly thereafter just an arrangement of some small degree of social and political convenience. Eleanor found herself busied elsewhere with a number of social causes that kept her away from her husband. In 1910, Roosevelt ran for the position as New York State Senator. The local Democratic Party, glad to have a Roosevelt name to put forward in a district that had been solidly Republican since before the Civil War, and shocked when he was actually elected to the position. In the Senate, he found himself in opposition to the New York Tammany Hall political machine, and consequently developed considerable experience in the art of political maneuvering, which helped him to be reelected to the Senate position in 1912 as something of a distinct social reformer or progressivist. But that same year, he had also thrown personal support to the reformist Democratic presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson, who was also running against Franklin's uncle, earning Franklin a cabinet appointment as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position he would hold for the next 7 years, which, ironically, was the same position also that his uncle had held in the early years of his national political career. Also, like his uncle, the younger Roosevelt actually had long been interested in naval affairs, was fairly well read up on the subject, and was fully capable of being an excellent contributor to American naval policy. He would continue to serve in this capacity through the years of the Great War. In 1920, the Democratic National Convention picked Roosevelt, only 38 at the time, to run as the party's vice presidential candidate, serving alongside the party's presidential candidate, Ohio Governor James Cox. But the election turned into a landslide for the Republican ticket of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. After the election, Roosevelt returned to his law practice in New York. But tragedy struck in August of the next year, 1921. He contracted polio while vacationing in Campobello Island in Canada, the polio leaving him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. A man of iron will, he refused to admit defeat by the disease and maintained his law practice while at the same time attempting various therapies. In 1926, he purchased a resort at Warm Springs, Georgia, not only for his own treatment, but for others also afflicted with the disease. His disease, in fact, had become for him something of a cause, and 2 years later he created the organization that would eventually become the famous March of Dimes, dedicated to fighting the scourge of polio. He also developed immense upper body strength and the ability to walk, at least short distances, with the aid of iron braces, often also leaning on the arms of an assistant, so as to not have to appear in public in a wheelchair. In the meantime, he kept up with New York Democratic Party politics, improving his relations with Tammany Hall, and supporting Alfred E. Smith in the New York race for governor in 1922 and again in 1924, which Smith won. Then for U.S. President in 1928, which Smith lost. At the same time, Smith encouraged and supported Roosevelt's candidacy for the New York governor in 1928, which Roosevelt won twice, making him the state's governor from 1929 to 1932, when he chose to run for the U.S. presidency. And in 1932, with the country caught in the depths of the Great Depression, his win over his Republican opponent Hoover, naturally blamed for the tragedy, was fairly easy. Roosevelt was elected to the U.S. presidency with one of America's widest margins of victory, 14% over his Republican opponent. The basic philosophy of the New Deal. As can be seen in the way Roosevelt attacked Hoover for his new government spending programs, which is exactly what Roosevelt would come quickly to advocate early in office, Roosevelt really did not have a specific set of plans in mind to deal with the Depression as he came to office in early 1933 as president. In his acceptance speech at the Democratic Nominating Convention in 1932, Roosevelt had talked about a New Deal for the American people, though he had not given any details as to what he might specifically be about. The idea New Deal soon became the program New Deal, and it meant whatever Roosevelt chose for it to mean as he struggled forward to put policies into play that might solve the problem of the Depression. Helping business and labor. Whatever it meant specifically, it meant generally that the national government was going to have to step into the realm of the economy and take the lead in getting things moving again. One of Roosevelt's early projects during his first 100 days, push, was the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, set up in 1933. It was a supposedly voluntary program that employers were supposed to engage in, promising that they would observe certain minimum pricing schedules for their products, that is, to stop the competitive lowering of prices designed to drive the competition out of business, and help their workers by offering at least minimum wages and maximum working hours. Those businesses which signed on with the program were permitted to display the Blue Eagle poster, but those that did not were often boycotted, and thus the voluntary nature of the program was compromised. There were complaints about this. Roosevelt also, in those first 100 days, created the CCC, that is the Civilian Conservation Corps, to provide 3 million jobs for young family men, building 800 national or state parks, and planting 3 billion trees. He put some price control policies in place, the Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1933, to help raise the incomes of the American farmer, essentially by taking land and thus crops out of production, thus raising the farmers' prices for their crops, but of course also making food more expensive for everyone else. Also in 1933, he set up the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, to control the Tennessee River flowing through the heart of the American South, offering not only flood control, but also electrical generation and transmission to the entire region, which previously had no electrical service. Supporting and regulating the banking and finance industry. In accordance with the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, Roosevelt set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, as a guarantee to Americans that their bank accounts were protected against bank failure, thus putting confidence back into the American banking system. Now, the FDIC is still in operation today. The act also prevented commercial banks, which receive checking and savings deposits and extend loans to individual Americans, from involvement in the realm of investment banks, which buy and sell stocks, bonds, and other securities. The next year, 1934, he set up the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to put the stock markets under federal regulation, to curb the excess of speculation that appeared to have caused the problems in the first place, and to put confidence back into the American stock market. The SEC is also still in operation today. He also, in 1934, created the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, also still in operation today, to ensure home mortgages and thereby stabilize the housing or mortgage market. Footnote: unfortunately, much of the regulatory work of the SEC and FHA was cut back by the Bush Jr. administration in the opening years of the 2000s, helping produce through the so-called shadow banking system the subprime mortgage crisis, which started in early 2007 and reached the level of a major financial meltdown in September of 2008. The growth of government as industrialist. Roosevelt also, through the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, of 1935, had the government move into the new realm of state-directed industry, the building of national highways, new libraries, government buildings, special camp and park facilities, even hydroelectric power generating dams. He hired artists to paint murals in public buildings and musicians and playwrights to compose new music and plays. His program even paid women to sew. Roosevelt also moved to strengthen labor's position in the bargaining with the owners of America's major businesses. The National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, of 1935. This gave a tremendous boost to the American labor movement and made the labor unions very loyal to the Democratic Party after that. Social Security. And the New Deal set up a program of basic Social Security for the elderly in their years of retirement, the Social Security Act of 1935. The program also included unemployment insurance and welfare support for the poor and handicapped. Commentary, quote, Roosevelt's New Deal brought us out of the Depression, unquote. No, not at all. It is common among most Americans today to refer to how Roosevelt's New Deal brought us out of the Depression when contemplating what to do in the face of new round of economic difficulties facing the nation. This popular myth, however, is quite untrue. Certainly, the New Deal helped many idle workers find work. It certainly built highways, dams, municipal buildings, national parks, rural electrification, new rail services, etc. Government projects were truly a blessing to many Americans desperate to find work. But these projects did not solve the problem of the Depression itself. The American free market, or consumer economy. America has long been a grassroots democracy, not only in the area of government or politics, but also in the very nature of its economy. Unlike most societies of the world, which throughout history have traditionally been driven by economic wants or goals of the rich and powerful, as emperors, kings, aristocrats, and priests, the American economy has been built since its origins in the early 1600s on the interests of very ordinary people. There have been, of course, exceptions to this picture: the slave-holding South prior to 1865 and the Gilded Age of the late 1800s, dominated by the captains of industry, or as some would say, the industrial robber barons. But in general, the American economic system has been built on the labor, the product, and the economic desires of very ordinary citizens. The personal or private consumer is king. What determines what actually gets made in America are the simple interests of the average American, known simply as the American consumer. These interests of the American consumer register themselves in what is termed the marketplace or free market. The matter of what gets made, how much gets made, and what it will cost are all determined simply by how much interest the American consumer has in a product when it goes to market. If it is really a hot item, drawing strong consumer interest, it will enter the marketplace quite pricey and highly profitable to the producer. But other producers with a typical American entrepreneurial spirit will want to get into the act and also begin producing this highly profitable product, or, under copyright laws, something somewhat like it, and bring it to market and themselves share in the blessings of high profits. But this entrepreneurial urge will eventually be met with a declining consumer interest, as most of the people who wanted these hot items now are in possession of them, whether we're talking about radios, cars, tractors, washing machines, etc. Unsold items will begin to pile up on the market shelves. To move these items to sale, producers will attempt to make these same products continue to be attractive, thus the American advertising industry, but ultimately attractive through lower pricing. Lower prices will help bring some additional consumers to the market, but not at the rate that they were there when the item was hot. At this point, the producer has to make some decisions. He can continue to make the product, though at a slower rate, which means he's going to have to cut back on production and let some workers go. He does not need their labor, and anyway, because his products are not selling well and profits are way down, he cannot afford to pay them. Or he can switch to a new product, even a new line of products, simply to keep his business going. This means he has to be inventive, imaginative, and a natural risk taker. He needs to listen to the market, to the consumer, to sound the consumer out in terms of possible interest in new products. He can also go to advertising in an attempt to create consumer interest by letting the consumer know in written or broadcast advertising, in words, songs, or even drama, how wonderful life would be if the consumer only had his new product. But this is how the free market works. The consumer is king. It's all very democratic. There is no political authority dictating production or distribution or pricing according to official decrees. In fact, the American free market system has traditionally been highly suspicious of such governmental interventions into the economic system, commonly termed a command economy, such as is typical of socialist or communist societies, and tolerates only the slightest of such interventions under very special circumstances and only for a limited time. For government intervention to go on beyond that would be to undermine the whole idea of the free market system. Market saturation. Of course, as with all social systems, this free market economic system is not without its problems. Market saturation, such as described above, when most consumers have these products and therefore show a declining interest in them, is one of these problems. This is a big part of what was happening to the American economy at the end of the Roaring '20s. The market for consumer products stopped roaring. The business cycle. Because of this tendency of the market to heat up as new products are brought to market, and then cool down as the market becomes saturated, industrial production and the economy in general tends to move in cycles of growth, maturity, and decline. Economists call this the business cycle. Economists have long attempted to find ways to smooth out the peaks and valleys of the business cycle, make the economy more steady in its movement, but the very nature of the free market system itself seems to make it immune from such efforts. Keynesian economics. The famous English economist John Maynard Keynes put forth the idea in the 1930s that the business cycle could be modulated or smoothed by the government's interventions as the economy goes through the various phases of a business cycle. He advocated a governmental strategy of loosening money supply, that is, creating more money for the market to work with during the cooling phase of the business cycle, and then tightening that money supply during periods of a hot market. This Keynesian theory seems to make a lot of sense to a lot of economists and to a lot of government officials. In a sense, Roosevelt's New Deal moved in accordance with this theory, but whether it actually contributed to or simply slowed down the recovery of the market economies in the 1930s remains, even to this day, a matter of great debate. New products. What is not debatable is the fact that what a free market truly needs to keep going or get back going if it has slumped and fallen into idleness is new products. New products are what bring the consumer back into the marketplace to do business. In a sense, the New Deal produced new products, but products desired not by the individual consumer, but collectively by the society. The New Deal produced highways, parks, public buildings, etc., items certainly desired by the average American, but products that no one single consumer would have ever been able to buy. So in that sense, the New Deal worked. It met the needs of the social consumer. Market saturation for government products, roads, dams, parks, etc. But even here, part of the problem was that the New Deal suffered from its own version of market saturation. Under the New Deal, a great number of national highways were built, but once built, Americans did not need new ones to replace them right away. Highway building slowed down. New dams were built at the most likely spots where energy could be cheaply generated. After that, dam building became much less cost-effective. Dam building slowed to a halt. Parks were built until the need for park building was greatly reduced. In short, the government as producer was facing the same problem that the private producer had faced at the end of the 1920s. Market saturation for government or social products. By the late 1930s, with the government cutting down on its building projects, unemployment began to rise again in America. Government intervention into the economy had taken up some of the slack in an idle American economy during a good part of the 1930s, but it had not solved the basic problem of the Depression. The American economy simply seemed to have no urge to take off again on its own. That's because new products were needed to bring the American consumer, the bedrock of the American economic system, back to market. But coming up with a new line of products to go to market with is not easy. It takes discovery, new technologies, changing circumstances, many things that are not automatically brought into being. And during the entire 1930s, there really was no such development of new product lines by private industry. Some blame the New Deal itself for the failure of new products, new technologies to develop during the 1930s. They claim that scarce investment funds were all used up by the government to push its own economic agendas. Financial capital that was needed to back up new inventions and new production was simply not available to the private entrepreneur because it was all flowing to the government. Perhaps this was true, but perhaps not. Clearly, there was another factor involved that unquestionably shaped the way the private industrial system was to behave in the 1930s. Consumer confidence. The New Deal put money in the pockets of the workers that built all these New Deal products. But what did the worker do with this money? In general, the worker put it away in a safe place. The old adage is that he put it under his mattress. Actually, he most likely put it in a savings bank. And thanks to Roosevelt's FDIC, Insurance of Bank Deposits, a savings bank was finally a safe place to put one's money. In any case, he was not going to put it in the stock market anytime soon. He was still too frightened about what might happen if he put his money there. So the workers' wages were of little help to the revival of the capital market, which financed the business ventures of private manufacturers. The banks where he deposited his money were of no help to the capital market either. And it was not just because banks, too, had been scared away from the involvement in that market. Actually, because of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, it was illegal for such commercial or depository banks to enter the capital market. Only banks licensed as investment banks were permitted to trade in the capital market. And these were not the banks where the worker placed his savings. Investment banks were not permitted to do this simple kind of business. They were the banks if you wanted to buy or sell or borrow, though with new limits, corporate stocks, bonds, or other kinds of corporate securities. Thus it was that workers' wages did not usually translate themselves into new inputs into the capital markets, vital to the recovery of private industry. In short, the average American wage earner now suffered from the economic disease of lacking consumer confidence in the marketplace. He earned his money and then put it away where it would go unused in stimulating new market demands. And thus the market continued to sit quietly while little happened in the private economic sector. The New Deal runs into serious problems. Mounting opposition to the New Deal. Roosevelt's first term in office, especially his first 100 days, saw the coming into existence of a massive number of government economic programs. Roosevelt seemed the master of the situation and encountered relatively little opposition. But towards the end of his first term and in the early part of his second term, Roosevelt found his programs coming under a lot of criticism and even determined opposition. Criticism began to build about how his New Deal was becoming simply creeping socialism. There was also mounting criticism about how many of these make-work programs were a waste of taxpayers' money. Jokes and sneers arose about all the standing around that seemed to accompany many of these work projects. Problems with the Supreme Court. The biggest problem, however, was the Supreme Court. By 1935, the Supreme Court was knocking down one program after another of Roosevelt's New Deal for being unconstitutional. According to the Supreme Court, there was no constitutional basis for the national government to be meddling in the affairs that were clearly reserved to the states as part of their jurisdiction. The worst blow came on Black Monday, May the 27th, 1935, when the Supreme Court pronounced unanimously on 3 cases, all of them going against Roosevelt's New Deal. The hardest of them for Roosevelt to swallow was the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States case, in which the court declared the NRA was unconstitutional. The NRA, in violation of the Constitution's design of the separation of powers, had assigned legislative powers to the presidency that belonged alone to Congress. But also Congress's use of the Interstate Commerce Clause to justify the creation of the NRA program was clearly in excess of the powers allocated Congress by the Constitution. But more such anti-New Deal decisions were to be handed down during the next year. The court packing scheme. Roosevelt was so upset by this personal rebuff by the Supreme Court that he decided to remake the ideological character of the Supreme Court. In early 1937, he announced that he would be introducing into Congress a new judiciary reorganization bill, expanding the number of the court's justices. The political intent was clear to all. He was going to pack the court through the presidential power of appointment with enough new justices to swing the Supreme Court rulings in his favor politically. The public reaction was negative, despite Roosevelt's many efforts during the spring of 1937 to enlist popular support for his idea. To the contrary, opposition to the idea grew with the passage of time. Opposition in the House of Representatives was apparent from the outset, so Roosevelt introduced the bill into the Senate instead. But the Senate dragged on in its debate. Eventually, a split began to open up between the president and the senators of his own Democratic Party. Roosevelt was losing political ground fast. But in the meantime, a switch of votes in the Supreme Court had occurred, with one of the justices changing sides from anti to pro-New Deal, and another justice retiring, thus giving Roosevelt the opportunity to make a new appointment. He now had a voting majority without having to pack the court. Roosevelt backed down on his court-packing scheme, but he had lost a lot of political standing in the process. Many Americans felt that Roosevelt was taking notes from the high-handed ways of the European dictators, Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini. Roosevelt not only had gambled personally and lost in this contest, his attack on the Supreme Court also greatly weakened his ability to continue the political reforms he felt the country needed to undergo in order to get back to sound economic health. Bad economic news continues. This event was also timed with another slowdown in the American economy, which hit in 1937. Resulting in the growth again in the number of unemployed Americans. 1938 was not any better economically, and 1939 saw only a very slight economic recovery. There seemed to be little that Roosevelt could do to get the economy back on track again. The Midwestern Dust Bowl. To make matters worse, during the entire 1930s, but becoming incredibly intense in the mid-1930s, a deep and persistent drought hit the Midwest states, worst in the Panhandle area of Texas and Oklahoma, northwestern New Mexico, western Kansas, and eastern Colorado, but extending all the way from central Texas in the south to the Dakotas in the north. The topsoil was simply blown away by hot winds, which turned the air into black clouds of choking dust. Farms were simply abandoned as destitute farmers headed west to California to look for work, any work. Most of them ended up living in migrant workers' camps under the worst conditions imaginable. People survived, but only by toughening up tremendously. With all of this happening to America, Roosevelt found his popularity slipping during the latter part of the 1930s. He would not regain the popularity he had in the first of his terms in office until the entrance of America into World War II in late 1941. World War II finally brought America out of the Depression. In the end, what brought America out of the Depression was not the New Deal, but was World War II, which the country embarked upon only at the very end of 1941. The war, and the war alone, proved to be the factor that would put America back to work. New products, uniforms, guns, fighter planes, bombers, tanks, trucks, cannons, battleships, carriers, submarines, etc. would be needed in vast, virtually unlimited quantity. Every American that was not in uniform would be needed to support the war on the home front. In particular, even young women working in the production and assembly plants where these products were manufactured. And there was no danger of market saturation, at least until the war was over. Such products were quickly destroyed in the action of war and thus immediately called forth replacement products. In the American economic system, the government did not make these products. Private industrial manufacturers did. Of course, the finished product did not need to go to market. The government was the market, under contract to buy the product as soon as it came off the assembly line. But as with the New Deal economy, the average American was the financial underwriter of the war economy. Part of this support was in the form of taxes paid to the government, which Americans were quick to offer because this was their war, not just their government's. But taxes were not sufficient to cover the huge government expenditures involved in this business of war. The government needed to go into deficit spending, borrowing money now with the promise to pay it back later when the emergency of the war was over. And who was the lender to the government? Well, the American people themselves. They lent to the government huge amounts of their personal industrial earnings, created by war production, in the form of war bonds, contracts or certificates issued by the government which promised the American lenders that they would be repaid in the future with nice interest earnings added. Purchasing war bonds turned the average American into a capital financier lending to the government. The possibility of guaranteed interest earnings was part of the motivation. Besides, what was a person to spend his or her money on anyway? Automobile manufacturers had turned to the business of making army trucks and tanks. No automobiles were manufactured during the war. Except for war goods, there wasn't much of anything to spend your money on anyway. Everyone was under the rationing, so you couldn't even go on a food spending splurge. So, putting your money away in the form of war bonds made natural sense. Besides, it seemed to be one's patriotic duty. And that's how the American economy came back to life. World War II, not the New Deal, brought America finally out of the Great Depression.